Okay. Okay. Nathan, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. Can
A little
everybody hear me?
louder. A little louder.
Let's see. I'll adjust this. All right, everybody. How is that? Okay. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Jews of Latin America, specifically 1492 to about the year 1800. Now, this is part of a paper I wrote in for my master's degree where we had to talk about the history of Latin America, and we could kind of tailor the paper any way we wanted to, but I wanted to talk about the Jewish experience. Especially with what happened with 1492 with all of the Jews going to the Ottoman Empire, like I talked about last week. This week, I wanted to focus on the different experiences between the Jews that went to Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, because those were the three largest concentrations of Jewish populations. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see my slideshow?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So again, my name is Nathan Lark. This is part of a multi-part series where we talk about Jewish history. So this is the third and final one that we're going to do for the time being. If anybody has any ideas of what they would like to see in the future, please let the adult education department know, and we'll see what we can come up with. So to gain a better understanding about what the different experiences were like, I wanted to concentrate specifically on Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. There were many places to choose from, but these being the three largest concentrations of immigration, I wanted to focus on these. Now, I noticed there were some things that interwove these places. It was the citizenship, what were some of the cultural myths and historiography, the fear of persecution, and the inquisitions that were happening. All of these influenced the history that I researched. So you'll start to gain a better understanding of why it's really difficult to get an accurate history from 1492 until about the year 1800, with the official end of the Spanish Inquisition being in 1834 and 1821 for the Portuguese Inquisition. Originally, when I had started researching this, I had no idea that the Inquisitions went on for hundreds of years in different capacities. So, to recap a little of what we talked about last week, the 1492 Edict of Expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, 1492 being Spain, 1497 being Portugal, saw many sought out new locations to be far further away from the persecution. Now, while many Jews traveled to Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, many also traveled to Latin America. Within Latin America, the history of the Jews was difficult to pinpoint as there were many factors that narrow the scope of a proper research. I need to fix that sentence later. So, by the 1500s, Queen Isabella was instructing the governor of Hispaniola to bar any Jew from settling in the Indies, with King Charles V repeating the order in 1522 to include Jewish converts. Now, illegal immigration was subject to the Inquisition, and as we go through this PowerPoint, you'll see how very vague in general the Inquisition was and what you could do to be deemed as a Jew or a Jew in secret. So the choice to immigrate, regardless of the orders, was due to all of the violence that the Jews were faced in their close proximity to the Iberian Peninsula. So Jewish immigration was the heaviest for Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, but the records for that immigration were very difficult. All of the records are very inconsistent. Persecution, government bias, and citizenship laws made it really difficult to track down very specific information. Now, there were counts made at each time period, but they were wildly inaccurate. There were no numbers presented for Jews from the late 15th century to the late 19th century. Jews were not even a legal presence 300 years into colonial rule by Iberian powers that preceded the birth of these independent states. So I wanted to do this presentation like we just talk about Mexico, just talk about Brazil, just talk about Argentina, but I found it difficult considering I wanted to talk about the bias, the citizenship laws. So this presentation may seem a little out of order, but this is what I have for now. So for Mexico, the power of the church made it very difficult for Jews to be public with their religion, and it was impossible for them to gain citizenship. The Catholic Church would reign supreme over Mexico even into the 1800s. The year 1824 was the official statement that the official religion of Mexico would be Roman Catholic Apostolic or Apostolic. Yeah. It would be only in 1843 that Jews were allowed to become citizens once the strict Roman Catholic citizenship rule was repealed. Even though they were still allowed to be citizens after 1843, their religious services were still seen as illegal. By the late 19th century, there were Jews that were involved in mining, railroads, jewelry store owners, hotel managers, and owners, just to name a few. A number of patents in 1895 showed that Jewish immigrants had entered manufacturing with printing presses, like we talked about last week with the bringing the printing press to the Ottoman Empire. There was even photographic paper production and an apparatus for drying cement, among a few of the patents that came out from Jewish immigrants. So for Argentina, the government was more secular, decreeing in 1810 that English, Portuguese, and other foreigners who are not at war with us can move to this country and will enjoy the rights of citizenship, and those who dedicate themselves to the crafts and the cultivation of the countryside will be protected by the government. So it was very different in Argentina than Mexico for the treatment of Jews. Even to this day, the highest concentration of Spanish-speaking Jews is in Argentina. So if we want to dive a bit deeper into that, that can be a part 2 of this presentation where we can talk much more about that. One interesting fact I found is that even into the 80s, there was a kosher McDonald's in Buenos Aires. So I thought that was an interesting fact. So speaking more about Argentina, marriage was not allowed for Jews as their ceremony would have been non-Catholic. This was relaxed in 1825, but only in the city of Buenos Aires. The first record of an Argentine Jew was from 1835, born to a Jewish father. Now, the historian Judith Elkin, who wrote The Jews of Latin America, included that the first record of a Jewish community that was from 1860 when the Argentine government authorities allowed 2 Jewish weddings to take place only after a Catholic lawyer was able to convince a court that the marriage was a necessary community evil. So some cultural myths regarding Jews in Latin America were that maybe Sephardic communities were reported as being isolated from one another. There was a failure to incorporate the importance of cultural mixtures, only focusing on Jews that were affiliated with community functions, and only fractions of evidence were used to skew perceptions. So even for the histories written into the 1900s, there were so many wild inconsistencies and falsities in Jewish history, so that historians have had to go back and rethink the way they want to write history for Jews in Latin America. So it wasn't that far away that many, many inaccuracies were still being printed and taught in the schools. I could have gone way deeper into that, but that was a very different tangent that I edited for time. If anyone's interested, I can talk a little bit more about that. Regarding specific terminology, the historiography of Jews in Latin America used the terms conversos, new Christians, crypto-Jews, and Judaizers. According to historian Margaret Bejarano, conversos were converted Jews and their descendants, also known as new Christians. She made the distinction with her history to differentiate them from crypto-Jews, who were Jews that secretly practiced Judaism within the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. It's important to be familiar with these words because as you start reading the laws, the decrees, the Inquisition, these words start to pop up a little more, and you start to see why things are skewed in a different direction and what historians can do to start to make the narrative more accurate. So we are about a third of the way through the presentation. I would like to take a pause here in case anybody had any questions that I could answer or anything anyone would like to say. Yes, Kevin and Sue.
Okay.
One of your slides referred to Jews in Mexico around 1895. That is the same time period. There was a lot of immigration to this country from Eastern Europe. Did any of the Mexican Jews at that time, were they Ashkenazic instead of Sephardic?
So for the purposes of my presentation, I had only focused on the Sephardic part of it. I can do more digging onto that. This was part of a series of papers that I wrote that was trying to track down specifically Jews that immigrated from Spain. So there probably is a lot more information on that. So I can absolutely research that for a second presentation or a third presentation if we want to make this into a series. Yes, Alan.
So I'm confused about the fact of there being not crypto, yeah, crypto Jews and Jews who openly practiced. So why were some people practicing in secret and at the same time other people were practicing openly?
I think I might answer that later in the presentation. If I don't, I will circle back to that.
Okay.
Uh, Mark, did you have a?
You said one of the myths before was that people were isolated from the broader community. So I'm just wondering in general, they were not in ghettos during this time, or
So that was part of what I cut out of the presentation because there actually was a lot of communication and sharing of supplies, sharing of knowledge between all of the communities, but they weren't isolated. They were isolated in their areas, but they weren't isolated from communication and contact with one another. That was the myth, that there
uh,
was no
uh,
communication whatsoever. But with a lot of the schools, which is another part I cut out of the presentation, there was a lot of sharing of like materials, educational supplies. So all of them were in
well,
communication, but they weren't near each other.
thank you.
Does anyone else have anything? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and continue. Let's see. Okay, can everyone still see the presentation? Okay. Let's see. So the gaps in historiography centered around the tendency of some historians to only focus on community institutions, their activities, and the Jewish publications, but they ignored Jews that were not affiliated with community institutions. So this myth tended to intertwine the myth that, sorry, I'm trying to get the little box out of the way. Uh, the myth tended to intertwine with another myth that Jews in Latin America did not assimilate within communities. Recognizing daily experiences, food habits, and dual identities would help to establish a better history of Jewish life in Latin America. So a lot of the histories I found only wanted to focus on one, and they would exclude other parts, which would feed into the communities being isolated from one another. So crypto Judaism in the New World did not exist in isolation, but created a complex web of familial, economic, and cultural ties in a global network of fellow conversos, openly professing Jews in Europe and the Americas. Now, for the Jews that practiced openly, those would be more of the areas in Argentina where the Inquisition wasn't as heavy. So in Mexico, there would not be any secret and openly people who openly practice Judaism. That would only be in areas where it was more lax with the oppression. Fear of persecution in Latin America led many Jews to hide their identities, which made it difficult to try to get a comprehensive history of their journey and a lot of details about their communities. Due to a lack of ability to attend a public synagogue as the center of Jewish community, Jews are forced to worship in private, whether at someone's home, a place of business, or a secret community center where objects and decorations would not give away the true intention of those worshiping. So, I wanted to highlight the trial of the Carvajal family in Mexico. So if there was one example of a Jewish experience in Mexico, I wanted to focus on this one because it was a very layered, very public trial that echoes to this day. So in the late 16th century, there was a nobleman, Luis de Carvajal the Younger. He came to Mexico, then known as New Spain, with his large, well-to-do family in the early colonization of the Americas. His family had governed the northern part of Mexico. His uncle was a governor. A political rival discovered that he was still a practicing Jew, even though his family had been converting to Catholicism. Practicing as a Jew in Mexico was a crime punishable by death in the times of the Spanish Inquisition, which hit very hard in Mexico. Older relatives had urged him to convert to Catholicism fully for his own safety, but he stuck to his faith. His memoirs that he wrote down, they were about the size of an iPhone. He wrote really tiny letters, or in very tiny lettering, but his memoirs explained what it was like to live as a secret Jew in Mexico, and this was an important history to be taught in Jewish places of learning. His memoirs were actually lost. They were lost for almost 100 years before being rediscovered and sent back to Mexico to be in the National Library of Anthropology in 2017. The excruciating details of his persecution were known because he kept these secret diaries. They were painfully crafted miniature manuscripts, like I said, almost microscopic handwriting in Latin and Spanish. Each of the memoirs, oh, sorry, I said that, but he had to keep them hidden. They suspect he kept them under his hat. That's why he kept the diary so small. But many of the details we know about the persecution, because there are Inquisition records, but they're highly in favor of the Spanish Inquisition. So this tells kind of the other side of that story. Before the Sephardim arrived in Latin America, Ashkenazi Jews were sectioned off into specific neighborhoods for easy identification by the governing bodies of Europe. Sephardic Jews in Latin America could more easily avoid detection by the Inquisition by living more spread out in cities and rural areas. With the fear of persecution forcing the secrecy of their practices, conversions, and lack of identifiable areas, it was more difficult to discern the number of Sephardic Jews in a Latin American area. Historians tend to focus harder on Ashkenazi Jews due to more accurate records of them and concrete information than Sephardic Jews that depended on the area of Latin America in question. Historians have pointed out that there were those within Argentinian high society that saw both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews on equal status, but that meant that all to be restricted and enforced with strict laws. Anti-Semitic laws, articles, and groups worked against all type of Jews from the late 19th to the early 20th century. Multi-generational suspicion of the damage that Judaizers and crypto-Jews could do to unravel the fabric of Argentine and Latin American culture altered the history that was written about them. So Jews and conversos spoke Ladino, like I said from last week, a mixture of Hebrew and Spanish, which allowed them to remove linguistic barriers between the communities and allow for that to be done easier. However, the controversy attached to Hebrew ensured that those who practiced Judaism would have moved into hiding. Speaking Hebrew out loud, especially in Mexico, would have drawn the attention of the Inquisition. Ladino would have blended with native tongues in Mexico. So historians have provided letters that prove that even until 1862, Jewish immigrants still wanted to outwardly display they were Catholic and keep their Jewish culture secret despite the neutrality displayed in the new Constitution. Other historians had backed up that information regarding the persecution in Mexico even post-Inquisition. When the Inquisition was abolished in 1821, there was one particular Jew who was set free after spending 33 years in prison following his trial in 1788, which proved that the laws were decreasing the criminality imposed on Jews. Even though the laws were beginning to relax and Jews were not in prison for practicing Judaism, there were still many fears of outwardly displaying Jewish roots. The presence of Jews in Brazil can be traced back to the 16th century when Jews who escaped the Inquisition on the Iberian Peninsula were still practicing their Judaism in secret. Around that time, they had begun to get involved with the first sugar plantations in Brazil. By 1645, there were about 1,500 Jews in the region, and the community was well organized with a Torah, Tzedakah, fund, and an executive committee. Members of that community were businessmen, teachers, writers, poets, and even importers and exporters. Now, a lot of this was under the safety umbrella of the Dutch. They had taken over portions of northeast Brazil, brought with them a tolerance for Jewish migration in the colonies, and as a result, many of the Jews flourished in commerce. When the Dutch were forced out by the Portuguese in 1654, Jews either fled or disappeared for their own protection. However, Portuguese anti-Jewish persecution increased during this time, and as a result, many Jews fled Brazil to places such as Curaçao, New York. The eventual abolition of the discrimination in 1773 saw the rebuilding of Jewish community, Ashkenazi Sephardic. But by the time Brazil gained independence in 1822, the community had solidly established itself. So some of the official documents, Inquisition records, government decrees that were used to start building the history of Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews in Latin America, they analyzed all of these different documents to try to start rewriting the history of the Jews outside of the Inquisition records that were very detailed but highly slanted. So they focused on breaking down Inquisition terminology, methods of examination, investigating their methods on social control to determine what were the flaws in their records. Even after the elimination of the Inquisition offices, it was difficult to filter out the Inquisition mentality from Latin American communities and promote Jewish history within them. There was a stigma embedded into the language. Even the word Judeo was meant to be a person that was a miser. Missionaries sent to Latin America after colonization ensured that the words Judeo and Diablo were synonymous when used to educate the Native Americans. The Spanish Empire sought to intertwine the two enemies of the Catholic Church. The devil and Jews were seen in an unholy alliance. This altercation ensured that the history of Jews would be omitted from Latin American chronicles. So, according to Inquisition records, if you held one of these following occupations, you could be tried by the Inquisition as a Judaizer or crypto-Jew and were subject to trial and or punishment. Merchant, vendor, doctor, lawyer, shoemaker, mayor, or even judge. So the Inquisition was seen as an instrument of societal control, and it followed a political playbook to ensure that power only remained with a certain group of people. The information provided by the Inquisition was subject to high scrutiny. One Inquisition claim was that crypto-Judaism was supposedly eliminated with the Carvajal family in 1596. They wanted to make that as public of a trial as possible. But even into 1649, Jews were still being persecuted, with one Tomás Trevino de Sobremonte being burned alive. The Mexican Inquisition formally, like I said earlier, would be abolished in, this is 1821. What I had was 1834. I'll double check that. So the Inquisition made many accusations of Jewish rabbis without specific evidence to back up those claims. Knowledge of Jewish history, customs, and language were not specific indicators of a Jew being a rabbi, so the history of Jewish leaders is also unclear within those particular records. Possession of books in Hebrew would have drawn an inquisitorial hearing, with the colonial Inquisition putting a harsh penalty on those who possessed those books for those of Spain or Portugal. Lack of books and records written in Hebrew to contest Inquisition claims limited the scope of a historical analysis past those records. So, though Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula were expelled in 1492, many of them fled to Latin America, trying to flee persecution, start a new life. But what kind of life that was and how many immigrated was very difficult to find out both Sephardic and Ashkenazi, because of the limited scope of the records that they had, the lack of citizenship laws, the cultural myths, fear of persecution, and biased records written by government officials. I feel like, as a historian, the frustrating thing I keep running into is, why isn't there a record of this? Why is there not a record of that? And even if I do find a record, how can we determine the validity of that particular record? So I wanted to find out as much as I could about the Sephardic experience in Latin America and how that compared and contrasted with the Ashkenazi experience, but I ran into many roadblocks, many potholes. So I still plan on doing more research, but I just wanted to do this presentation so we can kind of open up the discussion, and if there's any places where I could do a little more research and we can make this a more, in-depth session for later times, we can do that. So I wanted to pause right here and put a couple questions on the presentation. So what were the differences between the Jewish experiences in South America? Mexico, Argentina, Brazil. How is this information relevant today? What do the past different experiences do to shape relationships today, and what work can be done to fill in the gaps? So I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor so we can have this discussion. And any questions I can't answer, I'm going to write them down to do later research. Yes, Alan.
Not one of those four, but I'm just curious. 1492 and 1500. I think about what it was like here. It was pretty basic, primitive, not very well, not very well established, and obviously only the major population were Native Americans. So what did they meet in the three countries? Did they meet the same thing, mostly indigenous tribes? And the other question I had was, if it was so primitive in both places, um, what uh, kind of like directed more people to go to South America than went to North America?
So to answer that question, I struggled to find specific details. I mean, we talked about, who was writing the histories, who was allowing those histories to be publicized, any letters, like a lot of because we had the presentation where I talked about Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, and there was not as much information on Brazil as the other ones, with the most information being about Mexico because of the brutal Inquisition in Mexico, or Argentina, where there was more of a flourishing atmosphere. So it was very tilted, the histories, because I did weeks of research to find out what it was like, especially at 1492. But some of them, the histories I found started at 1600 or 1634. So I would love to do more digging and find out more of what it was like at 1492. But based on the research that I did, I could do more digging if I had more time to find that out. But I honestly didn't. So that would be an interesting thing to know. Yes, Julia.
Hey Nathan, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, it's Brian. We're on Julia's computer.
Okay.
That was really good. I was wondering if you also read the Jews and the Pirates of the Caribbean book. I thought it was fascinating how, when I read that book, that I'm sure it's called Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. Sorry. I thought it was really interesting how basically the whole pirate thing started with Jews trying to respond to everything that you shared, and that then it became like a reoccurring self like a cycle, if you will, um, because then they had to spend the Spanish Armada to stop the Jewish pirates, which then reinforced why, the Diablo and the things that you were also sharing about, what they were saying about us on the mainland. I'm just curious if you happen to look at that research.
It's on my long list of books I want to read. Um,
I
by the
highly
time
recommend it.
by the time I was like ending this paper, I was jumping into a paper about the Second Temple. So I was jumping from like paper to paper. But yeah, thank you for telling me about that. I'm definitely gonna read it. Rabbi Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. I may have misheard, but it sounded to me like at least in one of the countries, did your research um indicate that there were Ashkenazic Jews there before Sephardic Jews? I wasn't sure if I understood that or not, but I just wanted to check.
Um, I think let me open up the presentation again. I can't remember off the top of my head. Let's see. Oh, I don't know what button I clicked on. Okay. Oh, I see what happened. There's a
Hmm. Oh,
I'm
maybe it
not
was,
I'm
yeah.
not sure if it's the one where it's just because there were more accurate records of Ashkenazi Jews. I'm not sure if that was the one. I don't exactly remember what country that was. I can always go back to that later and provide you with a more accurate answer.
That's okay. So yeah, it looks like um but just kind of in general though, do you have a sense from the research um that Ashkenazic Jews generally came later than Sephardic Jews to those countries? Um, or not necessarily?
Honestly, I would have to do a little research on that and get back to you. I wouldn't be able to give an accurate answer right now.
Okay, that's fair enough. And I had one other um, thing I wanted to ask. I was intrigued by the list of professions that you had in one of your slides that said that they could be automatically suspected, that any one of those professions might be, subject to the Inquisition on the suspicion of being a Jew. So what jumped out at me, and this may have been something that is really more associated with medieval Europe, but I have had the impression that, for a long time, for centuries and centuries, most professions were closed to Jews, including law and medicine. And I saw that doctors and lawyers, Jews were allowed to go into business. They were allowed to lend money and be involved with banks. But my understanding that those two categories were about it. So I don't know. Can you shed a little light on um, why those other professions were? I was just surprised to see them there. That's all.
So this isn't much of an answer, but it's the answer I was able to come with. It's part of those Inquisition records. All the history books I read concerning this listed those professions because that was a tiny list. The list was much bigger than that.
Oh,
I didn't want to make the slide too big,
okay.
but everybody included that those were the professions, but they did not include why, how anybody came to that conclusion. It's the same when I was doing last week's tracing the immigration records where people were using multipliers for, oh, I think there's 4 Jews in a typical Sephardic Jewish family. And someone said, I think the average is 7.7, but they gave no indication of how they arrived at that. when they listed all these professions, nobody wanted to list like how they arrived at those. It was just that the Inquisition had this list and ran with it. So I would be interested in how they arrived at that list, other than them just having the list. And it's part of what these gaps in the history that I keep finding the more I dig.
Thank you. Thank
Yes,
you.
Kevin.
I'm not familiar with Latin American history and South American history, but the New World was discovered in 1492. In 1500, how many Europeans were actually in the New World in those countries?
I do not know the answer to that. I do know that it was difficult to get accurate counts at that time, especially because of who was writing the history. So I can't even give a general answer at this point.
I'm surprised that there was even enough of a community to have an inquisition in Brazil in 1500 or 1520. I mean, uh, if the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula went there, obviously it means that non-Jews went there too. But were these just missionaries? And I can't imagine they had large enough communities to really care that much about the few Jews who might have also come to them as well. So I'm really confused that because I don't have any idea. I assume all of the settlements were on the coasts. They didn't go into the interior that far. I don't remember also when the Spanish invaded Mexico. Does anyone know that year?
I do not remember off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Because I was surprised when I started researching this. I had no idea the Inquisition was so aggressive in the New World, even into the 1800s. I mean, that seemed like a number that was just that seemed like a year that was so much further off of what I thought, especially with it being so much further away. Yes, Barb.
Cortez was early 1500s in Mexico, like 1520s. So they were looking for gold.
Well, I can understand that later, once more people settled, and since it was dominated by the Catholic Church, that inquisitions became much more dominant. But maybe the point is that what you said last week, that the expulsions from Spain and Portugal didn't occur just in a few years. They occurred over several years, many years. And so they came to these countries and tried to hide their identity or tried to find places where they could form maybe secret communities. But I can see why the Inquisition was much more powerful once there were more Europeans there and once there were more Catholics there.
I have another question. If I can't see if there are other people waiting to ask. So is it can you see Nathan? If I guess if someone electronically raises their hand, they'll come to the top, I guess. You may have addressed this somewhat. I'm interested in whenever the Ashkenazic Jews got there, what the relationship was, if any, between the Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities. You might have talked a little bit about this last week too, but yeah, I'm curious if you you ran into anything in the research that talked about that.
There probably was a lot written in the history books that I researched. I wasn't hard focusing on that. I could do that for a later presentation. When I focused on that for the Jews in the Ottoman Empire, the clash between certain communities, especially like the Romanov Jews and the Sephardic Jews, like that affected the flux of the numbers, which was like the focus of me studying that. So I'd be happy to answer that question in a future segment of if we do another series like this.
Okay, great. I have one, I have one more question, but I don't want to monopolize you here. Right, this may sound like a silly question. I don't know. You mentioned the extremely small size of is it Carvajal? Is that the guy
The
who was
Carvajal family.
Carvajal family? But like the head of the family is the one who was prosecuted.
It was the nephew of the governor. So the governor, when he converted, he actually was a full Catholic, but his nephew was targeted because of his political standing, and the Spanish Inquisition wanted to make an example of that entire family when they set them all to burn.
So I was just trying to imagine. I mean, I don't know how a person. It seems like someone would need some kind of technological, even in the simple sense, assistance to write that small. Like to be able to see the letters that you're writing. I don't know. I mean, you know, maybe I'm just maybe I'm just used to writing very large letters, but I just imagine, for him to write like that, I imagine him having like a magnifying glass or something, because he didn't want anyone to, you said he didn't want anyone to discover it, obviously, and it sounds like he was writing it in such a way that even if someone found the parchment or whatever he was writing on, they would not be able to decipher it because of the very, very small size of the letters. Is that your sense?
I'm not sure. I mean, maybe that's why he wrote it. I know he was the theory is that he was writing it small to keep it under his hat, but um, I know that he was educated in a lot of uh, elite schools at the time, so he developed a style of penmanship that allowed him to write like that. But if you ever get a chance to look at the book, it's really interesting. For the longest time in my research, I didn't know anyone had actually found it. It was a big mystery because it had been missing for almost 100 years. But the archives of that area are in such disarray that my theory was that it was being used as a doorstop or something because it's just with the lack of proper library keeping, I don't think the book was stolen. I think it was lost. But if the book that arrived in the archives now is to be believed to be the original book from Louis Carvajal, then it was stolen and they were trying to sell it before it was discovered what it really was and then sent back to the Mexican government.
Great.
Yes, Barb.
Two comments on writing small. When I was teaching, I would do an open, they could bring a 3x5 file card to exam. And they could write extremely small. And the other was that when my niece and her husband, he was doing his final year of medical school, and he had arranged to be in clinics in various countries around the world, Bangladesh and India, Thailand, and such. And she would write on the onion skin airmail and very, very small. And in order to, and she would send it to my in-laws. And in order for them to be able to actually read it, I would take it to work and and copy it in double. And then they still had trouble seeing it because it was so small. So there was a lot of technique of being able to write very, very small because paper was very expensive or it was expensive to send. But yeah, the 3x5 file cards were just covered.
That's impressive. That's impressive. You didn't, I know this wasn't part of the presentation, but one of the things when we talk about I don't know if this I guess I want to ask what category these people would fall into, but you do hear stories about people who grew up in Latin America and, learned these kind of strange customs in their family of origin that, they never really understood. And then at some point when they, grew older, they realized that these, what seemed like random customs that they had been taught by their parents were all actually Jewish customs associated with like preparing for Shabbat, for example, or observing Shabbat. And so in the various categories that you presented at the beginning, do you think it's more, do you think it's likely that people in that situation came from one of those three categories more than another? Or do you think, over a period of time, any of those categories could have generated these kinds of rituals that were obscurely passed down in family systems?
So the labels that were used, some of them seem to intertwine. Some of them insist that they're a Jew, but they're practicing in secret. Some say that people are outwardly Catholic, but secretly Jewish, or some that kind of flip between it. The categories are a little bit confusing, especially when you're reading a lot of like the official transcripts, the documentation, the government decrees. But practicing in secret did start to affect customs, and especially with a lot of the language. So yes, there was this evolution, but it's not clear if it was practiced by one group in particular, because some of the groups tended to blend into others. I mean, I was constantly confused when I was reading a lot of these books over, I thought this person was in one category, but they're doing this. So even in those records, it was a bit difficult to follow. Yes,
Gotcha.
Barb.
And I'll fall back on my genetic background. About 25% of the South American population has some indication of Sephardic DNA.
Really?
When you exclude the Native American natives, yes.
Huh. That's an amazing statistic. Wow.
That doesn't imply
So
they're
they may
Jewish.
not have left written records, but the DNA is there.
Yeah, but that doesn't imply they came from Jews. I mean, is there a specific DNA for Sephardi Jews as opposed to Spaniards and
Yes.
Portuguese people?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
So if you think about it, there's a political pressure to leave, and there's boats leaving. So get on the boat.
That's amazing.
Now, some of these are pretty small numbers, 7,000. So, and how were the populations tested? How were they selected? Did they go to the local JCC and ask, but there's a significant proportion.
Fascinating. Are there any other questions that people would like to pose to Nathan at this point?
Yes. Maxine.
I was just curious if you have any plans to go to any of these countries yourself to look up the documents.
So I did go to Mexico City. I didn't have a chance to look up as much history because every time we went on a tour or history tour, I would try to ask some of these questions and they wouldn't. I didn't specifically look up tours that was Jewish history. There wasn't enough time. We were trying to pack as much into 1 week as we could, as far as like culinary and history tours and everything. Uh, it's on my plan to go back later. I'm actively learning Spanish right now, so I can start to look in some of those libraries and navigate a little better. I also have plans in the future of learning Portuguese, so I can look into those records as well. I want to continue doing this in the future. It's going to be a very long process because I'm age 34 trying to learn Spanish, and my brain is just short circuiting, especially with trying to do all this research and write these history papers and everything. But yes, I very much want to visit these countries and personally look into these archives and these libraries because from what I gather, especially with the archives in Mexico, a lot of them are just sitting there. They haven't been transcribed yet. If they have been transcribed, they haven't been tagged. So they might be sitting in an electronic database, but when you type to search, they don't pull up anything because they're there, but they haven't been tagged. So you'll see the same thing with Civil War documents. If people want to volunteer, a lot of the Civil War letters have been digitally inserted into the archive, but they're not tagged. So people can volunteer to read that, say, okay, this was North Carolina, this was between 1810 to 1820. So if you tag that, when people go and search it, they can find it. So from what I gather, a lot of the histories of Jews in Mexico could very well maybe in the library. They're just not tagged. They're not easily accessible. I would very much like to go and search that. I very much want to go to Argentina, Buenos Aires. That is on my list of places I want to go to, visit all the Jewish communities. So I would very much like to keep doing research and keep building on these for the future.
Hmm.
Do you know if AI has expanded into the Spanish language? I mean,
What do you mean?
if there are these documents in Spanish and they're on the web, then it seems to me that we now have AI tools that can scan these documents and pull out all kinds of information. I'm not a fan of AI in general, but it is a valuable tool if you're looking at basically a literature.
So I actually discussed that with my professors at my college. I said, if I was to use a translation software like AI, would I cite that in my paper? And they said no. And that struck me as strange because why wouldn't I put down what engine, what AI software translated that? Because if there's mistranslations due to an AI error, it completely throws off the history of what I'm looking into. So the fact that my school didn't have an answer for that was really strange. And I'm sure AI could do it with a high degree of accuracy. I would like to still learn the language for myself, but I'm still familiarizing myself with how to use AI tools to grab that. I'm still, you know, I feel like I don't want to learn AI, but I'm having to do it because other companies, my company is starting to understand how to use AI so we don't get left behind. So that is a tool I want to use, but I haven't just yet.
Nathan, do you have a sense of, I mean, I imagine that a majority of Jews in these three countries were concentrated in like the major city in each country, but do you have a sense of like whether, a couple hundred years ago or even today, like what percentage of Jews in Mexico live in Mexico City or um, I don't know, and what percentage of Argentinian Jews live in Buenos Aires and is it Sao Paulo in Brazil? Where's the largest concentration of Jews there? I don't even know.
Well, I have an answer to one of those.
Okay.
So it's currently estimated that up to 220,000 Jews are in Buenos Aires, which is the capital of Argentina. And it was before World War II, the highest concentration of Spanish speaking Jews was in Thessaloniki, which is, it used to be Salonika of the Ottoman Empire, but with everything that happened during World War II, the next highest concentration, especially with Spanish-speaking Jews, became Argentina. So
Huh.
it switched from that area to that area just because of the population. So I know that one, and especially with everything that happened, especially in the 50s and 60s, according to my research, an estimated 450,000 um, the waves of immigration to Latin America, just even 400,000 just to Latin America, but I'm not sure what concentration went in which direction. So I don't have that data with me.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Margie. I'm sitting outside, so it's dark. I just wanted to mention I was in Siena a number of years ago in Italy, and we went to the Jewish synagogue, and they took us upstairs to a library that they have that they were looking for people to be able to sort through the information. I don't quote me, maybe the documents were 500 years old. So there are different documents, different places. And as an aside, my father-in-law moved to, he started in shtetl in Russia, left in 19, I don't know, 15, so he wouldn't have to go into the army in Russia. And they went to Palestine, and from there they went to Argentina. And in the 1920s, they went to Mosesville, which Baron Hirsch set up. There were 14 different cities that were to train Jews on how to become farmers and agriculturalists. And then my father-in-law in 1949 then moved back to Israel and lived on the kibbutz. So when I went to the Jewish Museum in Buenos Aires, they had a fair amount of history there. I don't know how far back it went. Just thought I'd share those. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm excited to visit each of those places and look into those libraries.
Yep.
Any last questions for Nathan before we wrap things up this evening? Thank you for posting that, Nathan. So right. And thank you for making yourself available for follow-up questions. That's great. And I want to thank you for both of these presentations and opening up these lesser known historical windows in Jewish tradition, and really intriguing stuff, and definitely I think whets our appetite for diving deeper at some point. So just much gratitude, and thanks to Alan Fetterman for organizing, and we will look forward to the next time we can gather. I think the next formal adult ed offerings are going to be the Elul sessions in early and mid-September. So maybe see some of you there, and wishing everyone a good rest of the evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.